And now that we've come to our final show of 2020, I figure why not have a 2020 sports year in review headline segment. Jimmy, Nick, if you would just give me a couple minutes, I'll break down everything that has happened. And from there, we can kind of expand and talk about the sports year that was. And let's start. January 13th, the Houston Astros punished for sign stealing, $5 million fine, 1-year suspensions for AJ Hinch and Jeff Luhnow. We saw Alex Cora and Carlos Beltran also suspended. One of the biggest things to start our year off, but maybe not the most biggest thing, because on January 22nd, Kobe Bryant, Gianna Bryant, 7 others die in a tragic helicopter crash a day after LeBron James passed Kobe Bryant on the all-time scoring list. Moving on to February 2nd, fellas, the Kansas City Chiefs, they ended their 50-year Super Bowl drought. They beat the San Francisco 49ers in Super Bowl 54, come back from a deficit to win 31-20. Let's move over to March 11th, one of the probably the most crucial day for all of us when we all stopped working. Rudy Gobert obviously testing positive for COVID-19, prompting the NBA to shut down, and then the other professional sports leagues in North America and around the country really following suit, following that positive case. And from there, we move on from the summer, fellas, where we saw a lot of social justice activism. It started on June 22nd, NASCAR drivers standing with Bubba Wallace after a noose was found in his garage leading up to that race at Talladega Speedway. Some other things that we saw, the WNBA dedicated their season on July 24th to the death of Breonna Taylor. The Milwaukee Bucks on August 26th, they sat out a playoff game in protest to the death of Jacob Blake. And on September 12th, Naomi Osaka wore the names of Black victims of police and vigilante violence on her masks on her way to winning the U.S. Open. And again, throughout the summer, we saw all the North American sports leagues come back. The NWSL, the MLS, the MLB, the NBA, and the WNBA in their respective bubbles. And moving into the fall, fellas, our champions of the year, we know the Tampa Bay Lightning were able to get the Stanley Cup. The Seattle Storm win the WNBA finals. And for the city of Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Lakers back on top. They win the NBA finals in the bubble, get their first ring since they started off the decade in 2010 with a ring with Kobe and them beating the Orlando Magic. And for the Los Angeles Dodgers, their first World Series win since 1988. They take home that World Series title. And I wanted to finish off with some historic feats from women in sports. Obviously, the Miami Marlins hiring Kim Ng, becoming the first female general manager in a North American sport on November 13th. On November 28th, fellas, Sarah Fuller became the first woman to play in a Power 5 football game for Vanderbilt. On December 12th, she would ultimately become the first woman to score in a Power 5 football game, going 2-2 in PATs. But fellas, I say all that to say it has been such an unprecedented, and I know that word gets thrown around all the time. It's really become cliche at this point, but very much so an unprecedented year for us here in the sports world. Jimmy, I'll start with you. When you hear me go off on all these headlines, what are some of the headlines that stick out the most to you?
My head's spinning. Like there was stuff in there that I had forgotten about, to be honest. I think I'll take the positive route here in that 2020 hasn't been all bad. Yeah, there's been history. There's been racial justice in sports. There's been incredible feats that you listed off. And look, 2020 has been, on the whole, not a good year for basically anyone. And I think sometimes, as bad as it's been, it's also important to remember some of the good stuff that happened in 2020, because there has been good stuff, especially in sports. The NBA and NHL and NWSL bubbles were a massive success in terms of keeping players safe and crowning champions. You listed off some of the other stuff. So I just think it's really important to note that as bad as this year has been, it's not necessarily all bad stuff. Like there was I was laughing because there was a couple of weeks ago I was watching Jeopardy, and there was a category, it was good stuff in 2020. And you have to remember from time to time, that there has been, believe it or not, good stuff in 2020.
My head was spinning too. I was trying to keep track of everything that I had remembered, forgotten. Oh yeah, this team won that championship, and the list of events for sure. My biggest takeaway is the importance of sports in our society. I think is really the biggest thing, and how it can bring people together, and why we love doing what we do, right? And that to me is just the biggest takeaway. And whether that's being a catalyst for the important and necessary social change that we need in this country, or just as simple as giving people something to rally behind in a really difficult time, where 2020 has been really difficult for a lot of people for a long time, right? So it gives you an opportunity to sit back and watch LeBron James and the Lakers compete for a championship and ultimately win it, or the Major League Baseball postseason, and see the Dodgers finally break that drought and compete in a really great series against the Tampa Bay Rays. Or if you're a NHL fan, to see the Tampa Bay Lightning finally get over the hump, because it had been a while for them, a couple of really difficult playoff ousters recently. So to see them sort of come through and persevere was interesting as well. So it's always something that I come back to, and maybe think about a little bit more now than I otherwise would have, in getting some more perspective about what sports means to us. And that to me is the biggest thing, because I think a lot of times people can say, well, what's the point, or why are you spending your time on focusing on sports, or why do you like them, or whatever question that you want to pose or think of. But to me, that's the biggest thing, is how important they can be for us at times, especially difficult times, how they can bring us together even though we're apart, right? And that's the biggest thing for me in standing out, in addition to just sort of being a catalyst. It's really been as challenging a year as it's been. It's also been positive in a number of ways, and sports are at the forefront of that positivity for sure.
Yeah, that date, March 11th, when Rudy Gobert tested positive, at that time, a lot of us, we had heard about the coronavirus, but we didn't know it was going to come and impact us here. We had heard about it in China, but I think a lot of us, including myself, might have been a bit naive to think, well, that's over there. We should be fine here. And if it does come here, maybe a quick lockdown, people will follow protocol, and we'll be out of this, by the summertime. But again, that wasn't the case. And I think none of us expected the shutdown that would subsequently follow. But as you mentioned, Nick, and Jimmy too touched on it, I think for sports, that's that camaraderie, especially for fans, because, we're rooting for players, for teams that we love, and we're invested. We kind of escape from reality in order to, to root for these teams and kind of immerse ourselves in the sports world, if you will. But I think this year, more than ever, kind of proved to us that, the sports world and the real world, they're right with each other every day, every single step. There's always social issues that are converging with the sports world. And I think when you think about things like drivers standing with Bubba Wallace after that news, that news, it was just awful to know that, there's still people out there who feel and think a certain way and have, a racist mentality, for lack of a better word. But I think with a lot of these players and a lot of these teams taking their platform, Jimmy, and really using that to spread the message that, hey, sports is a place where everyone can come together and play on the same field, on the same court, on the same team, for the same, with players of different skin colors and nationalities. Sports is where everything converges, and where people really can find that, that common ground, rooting for a team, rooting for players. So I think that was great. But, I harp back to, to January 26th. And, when Kobe died, that was tough. We were Emmanuel Berbari, Sam Basil, who used to be here before he graduated in the summer. We were in St. Louis. And I remember Chris Hennessy was doing headlines that day on site in studio. And I think it was like 10 or 12 minutes before we were about to tip off. And Chris Hennessy just comes over and he says, hey, TMZ is saying that Kobe Bryant died. And I remember telling Emmanuel that day, like, I didn't really want to do the broadcast. And I felt like, here, seeing, experiencing that death, Jimmy, I just, I never thought in my wildest dreams going from that, to COVID, to the shutdown, that first half of the year was just so rough. But I really am grateful that once sports resumed again in the summer, that we just saw, players teams really kind of take that extra step to really do more to bring all of us back together as fans.
Yeah, and you touched on Kobe Bryant, and it's funny because he had such an impact on sports, and you talk about the convergence of sports and culture and life. And his death, I think, hit people who were not necessarily sports fans, in the same way John Lennon's death did, or Princess Diana, or Michael Jackson, like whoever it may be. He had that kind of impact on the world. And it was so shocking as well. And you, Andrew, wrote a really good piece for the Ram about this, and I read other articles as well, that it felt like he was so invincible, right? That when he was on the basketball court, he could do whatever he wanted to do. And that's what it felt like in life, too. Like, he was having a great post-career. His daughter, Gigi, who also died in the crash, was a great up-and-coming basketball player as well. And that's what made it so shocking and devastating, was that this was a guy who, I think it was Ramona Shelburne said this, bent the universe to his will, basically. And to have that happen, it still honestly doesn't feel real. Like, almost a year later, I'm sitting there like, there's no way. Like, there's just no way. But it unfortunately happened, and it's tragic and terrible. And it's still shocking to me, even though we're coming up on a year since it happened.
Certainly shocking to think about. And it's one of those, do you remember where you were moments? I feel like, because Kobe was just such a larger than life figure in, as you guys mentioned, not just in the basketball world, but just in the world in general, right? And enjoying such a great post career, as you hit on, Jimmy, and just a guy that I think a lot of people drew toward, not just because of the play on the basketball court, but because of that perseverance, because of what everyone called the Mamba mentality, right? That ability to persevere and to work hard and to do things that was so applicable to whatever you were doing, whether that be playing basketball or just doing your job on a daily basis, or playing whatever sport that you want. I think that he just was such an impactful figure in our culture, and that's what just made it so devastating. And then just to see the rest of it, and the 6 other members as well, and his daughter, and just the whole situation. It was such a rough way to start the year, as I think you guys really mentioned pretty well. And it's been good to at least get the sports back and to return to a greater level of being normal and trying to regain this sort of life that we once all lived. But that was certainly a tough way to start it, and something that I don't think anyone will be forgetting anytime soon.
Yeah, Nick, and even with, obviously the passing of Kobe Bryant and the pandemic, shutting everything down, aside that, we've seen some historic feats from champions. I mentioned the Kansas City Chiefs. They ended a 50-year, drought by winning the Super Bowl. The Dodgers won their first, World Series since 1988. LeBron added a 4th ring, to his resume and trying to chase Michael Jordan as the greatest of all time. So even with, these catastrophes that have happened throughout the year, we've seen a lot of achievement from teams. And I think the sports world was able to come to that. And I think when we look back on this year of 2020, we'll be able to look back at the Chiefs and the Dodgers, teams like the Lakers, the Storm, and Tampa Bay. They'll forever be etched in history, winning championships to start this decade.
I'll also bring up this point. When we were in the doldrums of like April and May, if I would have told you that every sport would crown a champion, either by the end of this year or early in 2021, I don't know what you would have told me, because we were sitting there and it was not looking good, to be very honest. And the fact that they were able to, the sports deserve a lot of credit. I think, the basketball and hockey in particular, I think, deserve a ton of credit for the bubbles and the hub cities and keeping their players safe that way. But just the fact that all this stuff actually happened, I think, is also really noteworthy because, there were plenty of times where we were sitting there saying, I don't know if this is going to work. And yet here we are with, schedules thrown off. Yes. And season shortened, of course, but still having, the team that wins the last game of the season hoisting the trophy. So I think that's really notable as well.
I agree 100%, right? You're trying to figure out how the heck all this stuff is going to happen in April and May, and like, hey, are we going to be able to go outside anytime soon, or what is that going to look like, as opposed to even are we going to crown a champion everywhere? So it's really impressive what a number of leagues have been able to do, and I'll throw some credit Major League Baseball's way too, because the bubble, as logistically difficult as that is, once you're able to get agreement and sort of get everyone in there, as long as you're strict in following the protocols, that kind of takes care of itself. It's much more difficult to try and operate and navigate the way Major League Baseball did and the NFL has done so far really pretty well this year. So a lot of credit goes to them as well, because they're trying to figure all this stuff out. Of course, when you're not in a bubble, it's never going to be perfect. And you're never going to sit there and say, Major League Baseball got an A+ with this. I thought the Justin Turner situation is something you can't ignore at the end of the whole World Series. And that was something that I thought kind of was really unfortunate, because it put a damper on how well things had gone up to that point, and really put a damper on the Dodgers celebration too. It was one of those things where it's like, dude, just stay in the clubhouse or wherever you're going. It's tough, but you got to make sure that you're doing things the right way. So that was the one hiccup, but a lot of credit goes to them too, I think is something that can't be ignored, because I don't want to say the bubble's easy, because it's not, but at the same time, once you get everything set up, you're in pretty good shape. It's navigating the players and everything that happens in daily life and testing and all this stuff that has been, to me, really sort of impressive in that sense too.
Yeah, back in the spring, I definitely was on the side of, hey, we're not playing sports until everything is back to normal. But, fast forward now to, the end of the year, I'm grateful. I'm happy that, these professional sports leagues were able to figure it out and provide some semblance of normalcy for us. And I want to give us here at WFUV Sports a special shout out, because for a few months, we were having one-on-ones with no content whatsoever. We were, tracking the pandemic, what was happening, how sports were reacting, but we really didn't have anything to kind of bounce off of like we do now. So I would say for us here at WFUV Sports, I think we did a hell of a job giving our viewers about as much content as we could. And now fast forward to the end of the year, just grateful that we have sports, and hopefully going into 2021, we get back, it probably won't be 100% normalcy, but get closer and closer till, fans can come back and root for their teams. Someplace like Toronto, they can have Jurassic Park there and people can stand next to each other and root for their team. Hopefully we can get back to that, Jimmy. But again, such a tumultuous year, something that we've never experienced and may never experience again.
Yeah, definitely a tough one. And I could definitely attest being part of those first few weeks back. And shout out our producer, Alex Wolves, who is kind of the reason why we're here at this point. He came up with the infrastructure for this operation, and it helped us a lot. But I remember those first few weeks, we were trying to figure it out. It's like, what are we going to talk about? I don't know, because there's no games. But eventually we did figure it out, and that's testament to you guys and everyone here at WFUV, Bobby, Emmanuel, Jackson, everyone doing a great job on that front.